The media declared Trump victorious. Canada had seemingly capitulated, abandoning its digital services tax mere hours before implementation. Trump resumed trade discussions and proclaimed success. However, beneath the surface, tensions were intensifying. Now Trump is escalating further, focusing on one of Canada's most critical industries, automotive manufacturing. As the crucial deadline approaches, Prime Minister Mark Carney is indicating this battle is far from concluded. This has evolved beyond a simple tax dispute. It's become a struggle for economic survival, with two nations locked in confrontation and one industry at the epicenter. The president continues discussing obstacles like supply management, clearly targeting the automotive sector. The situation is escalating with only 19 days remaining. Since March 2025, the United States has implemented a 25% tariff on Canadian automobiles with limited exceptions for U.S. manufactured components. This action severely impacted the integrated cross-border supply network. Canada ships approximately 85% of its automotive production to the U.S., primarily through systems where components cross the border 6 or 7 times before final assembly. However, tariffs disrupted this established pattern. U.S. automakers, confronting cost uncertainty, suspended numerous new tooling programs in Windsor, Ontario, Canada's automotive center. Some facilities reduced their workforce by up to 50% by mid-2025. Even transportation logistics stalled. Truckers reported reduced traffic and fewer cargo loads. With over 70% of U.S.-Canada trade transported by truck, the disruption spread rapidly. Donald Trump appears determined to eliminate Canada's automotive manufacturing capability. This strategy seems self-destructive. April 2025 delivered additional negative developments. According to Statistics Canada, Canadian automotive exports to the U.S. declined 23% compared to April 2024. The chain reaction was immediate. Halted production, unemployed workers, frozen investments. Yet amid this damage, Carney began strategic recalibration. In early July, the Prime Minister convened with senior executives from Ford Canada, GM Canada, Stellantis, and the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. In private meetings, they developed response strategies ranging from legal options to production relocations. One contentious issue was Canada's zero-emissions vehicle mandate. As of the first quarter 2025, EVs comprised only 8% of new vehicle sales. However, legislation required that 20% of all passenger vehicles sold in 2026 be EV or hybrid. Automakers warned this target was unattainable. Failure would mean purchasing carbon credits or paying up to $20,000 per vehicle for charging infrastructure. Confronting economic challenges and corporate resistance, Carney demonstrated flexibility rather than surrender. He also pursued longer-term reforms, eliminating interprovincial trade barriers and accelerating free trade initiatives with Europe and Asia. This shift followed Australia's model of diversifying away from U.S. dependence. This wasn't retreat, it was strategic repositioning. Trump's next deadline is July 9th, when his temporary tariff suspension expires. Unless Canada offers new concessions, additional tariffs could be implemented, potentially targeting previously untaxed sectors. However, Carney has marked his own date, July 21st. That's his deadline for a new Canada-US agreement. If no deal is reached, Ottawa could reintroduce retaliatory tariffs covering over $125 billion in U.S. goods from agriculture to technology. Meanwhile, public resistance is already emerging. The Buy Canada movement is expanding. Consumers are abandoning U.S. wine and spirits. Cross-border travel has decreased. Florida vacation properties are entering the resale market. Canadians aren't waiting for policy changes. They're expressing preferences through purchasing decisions. Behind the scenes, Canada is also working to expand trade relationships with the EU and Indo-Pacific region, building economic resilience beyond Washington's influence. The next 2 weeks will determine everything. Will Trump push further, confident that Canada will yield again? Or has he overextended, forcing Carney into a position where retaliation becomes politically necessary? On July 9th, we may see initial answers. By July 21st, we'll know who retreats and who responds aggressively. This isn't merely about automobiles, it's about leverage, leadership, and how far each side will go. In the Northeast, tourism is down between 20 and 60%. With trade deadlines approaching and no G7 summit agreement, Canada is now preparing to retaliate against the U.S. with new tariffs. This summer, something unprecedented is occurring across the U.S. Northeast. Airports show reduced activity, hotels report lower occupancy, retail establishments in Boston and New York are experiencing decreased foot traffic. The cause, Canadian tourists, previously a dependable economic contributor, are no longer visiting. The statistics reveal the situation. According to Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey, Canadian tourism across New England has dropped between 20% and 60% compared to previous spring travel periods. This isn't coincidental. It's the ripple effect of Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada and Ottawa's measured but deliberate response. Canadian tourists are simply absent from this region. School trips that normally occur in spring have been cancelled. The impact extends beyond airports. Educational trips from Canadian provinces have been cancelled. Regional airlines serving Logan Airport report decreased cross-border traffic. Restaurants and local businesses in tourist-heavy areas across New York and Vermont are experiencing reduced revenue. The tourism industry has become one of the first clear casualties of trade policy that few expected would directly affect consumers. The Northeast region is experiencing this, and Florida is seeing similar patterns. Numbers are significantly down regarding Canadian tourists, and it's not limited to the Northeast. Florida, traditionally a destination for Canadian visitors during winter and spring, is also experiencing sharp declines. These absent travelers are removing millions in lost revenue from the U.S. economy, not through protests or tariffs, but simply by staying home. U.S. wine exports to Canada collapsed in April, declining more than 90%. While tourists are disappearing, wine sales are similarly affected. In April 2025, U.S. wine exports to Canada dropped by an astounding 93% year-over-year based on trade data reported by CBC News and the American Association of Wine Economists. Before the tariffs, Canada represented over one-third of U.S. wine exports by value, primarily higher-end wines averaging $7.50 per bottle, significantly above the global average export price of $5. With those exports now nearly eliminated, U.S. producers face supply surplus. California wineries, producing 93% of U.S. wine, now have excess inventory and declining prices. Bulk buyers like the UK remain available, but at substantially lower prices. Premium markets like Canada and China are closing. Overall, U.S. wine exports fell 43% in April 2025 compared to April 2024. The consequences aren't theoretical. They're affecting financial statements across agriculture, logistics, and distribution. This represents recognition that these are allies with long-standing relationships that shouldn't be destroyed overnight. Beyond travel and wine, broader economic pressures are developing on both sides of the border. In the U.S., tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel are being transferred to consumers. A 2025 report from the Healey administration estimates that New England households could experience a combined $2.5 billion increase in heating costs over several years due to higher imported material costs. Meanwhile, small businesses in retail, food service, and healthcare are experiencing increased input costs. Many are reconsidering Canada-based suppliers or reducing operations. In Canada, the pressure is more indirect but substantial. Supply chains connected to U.S. markets are strained. Exporters are adapting to bypass American ports, and consumers are experiencing delays and product substitutions on imported goods. This is no longer a tariff dispute at the policy level. It's an everyday economic challenge for workers, consumers, and local economies. Carney is determined to protect Canadian businesses. Canada is willing to sign a security and economic or commercial agreement with the United States that serves Canada's best interests exclusively. Prime Minister Mark Carney has maintained measured language, but his timeline is now established. If no trade agreement is reached with the U.S. by July 21st, Canada will impose new tariffs on American steel and aluminum. The announcement came less than 3 weeks after the G7 summit in Alberta, where Trump signed a separate agreement with the UK but left negotiations with Canada unresolved. Carney has stated Canada is open to a bilateral agreement, but only one that aligns with national interests. His strategy involves pressure without escalation. Let economic damage communicate more effectively than political rhetoric. Canada didn't protest loudly. It didn't launch campaigns. It simply stepped back. The decline in tourists, the collapse in wine exports, and rising consumer costs represent the quiet consequences of a trade war that's no longer theoretical. While Trump's tariffs continue generating debate in Washington, the real impact is being felt in store prices, utility bills, and unsold California wine inventory. This isn't just about policy anymore. It's about economic pain and who's willing to end it first. As Canada's relationship with the United States deteriorates, Prime Minister Mark Carney is strengthening ties with Europe. Carney has signed a strategic defense and security partnership with the European Union, an agreement that emerges as Canada redefines its relationship with the United States and pursues a new trade deal. This summer, something unusual occurred at the NATO summit. While President Trump pressured allies to increase defense spending and intensify tariffs, Canada took a different approach entirely. It signed a comprehensive agreement not with the United States, but with the European Union. For Washington, this felt like a challenge. For Ottawa, it was a calculated pivot that communicated to the world, if America won't lead, we will find new partners who will. At the center of this shift lies a quiet but significant confrontation between two leaders, President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney. Carney and Trump have committed to reaching a trade agreement by mid-July. Trump likes tariffs and has stated this repeatedly. Canada must find ways to demonstrate that the same goals can be achieved through other means that don't involve these punishing tariffs, especially on strategic goods. The tensions didn't emerge suddenly. They had been developing for months. In early March, Trump's administration imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, along with a 10% tariff on energy exports. Branded as liberation tariffs, the White House claimed they addressed fairness and national resilience. However, in Canada, the action felt devastating. For industrial communities like Hamilton or Sault Ste. Marie, places built around steel mills and energy facilities, orders disappeared, layoffs spread. Between January and May 2025, Canada's manufacturing sector lost over 59,000 jobs, according to Statistics Canada. For Prime Minister Carney, a former central banker with extensive understanding of supply chains and capital flows, this wasn't merely about diplomacy. It concerned livelihoods. He made this clear. If a U.S. deal wasn't reached by July 21st, Canada would respond forcefully. Ottawa established a clear position: remove the tariffs or face targeted countermeasures. The message was firm but composed. Trade should be fair, open, and reciprocal. However, Washington wasn't yielding. President Trump, in characteristic fashion, showed little interest in compromise. Tariffs worked, he said, and negotiations only if Canada approached on his terms. Canada will build trading relationships with like-minded partners, reliable partners aligned with Canadian values. It begins here. So Carney pivoted quickly and deliberately. Days before the NATO summit in The Hague, he traveled to Brussels and signed a strategic security and economic partnership with the European Union. The agreement covered defense procurement, LNG cooperation, critical minerals, and commitment to deepen digital trade infrastructure. For Canada, this wasn't merely independence demonstration. It was a structural move to diversify away from American influence. The partnership includes aligning Canada's industrial policy with Europe's, developing new nuclear energy agreements, and creating rare earth supply chains together. German-built submarines and expanded naval integration were also included. Simultaneously, Canada pledged to meet NATO's 2% spending target and aim for 5% over the next decade, roughly $150 billion annually, according to Canadian Department of Finance projections. A significant portion would be invested in domestic resilience projects like mining, port upgrades, and infrastructure to transport Canadian minerals across the Atlantic. The objective? Reduce dependence on both the US and China, strengthen European ties, and signal to Washington that Canada isn't waiting for permission to modernize. In Brussels, Carney stood alongside EU leaders, emphasizing shared values: open trade, defense cooperation, rule of law. The symbolism was unmistakable. In Washington, officials remained largely silent. For close observers, the silence was revealing. The Canada-EU agreement wasn't spontaneous. It had been developing for months, but its timing, weeks before the US-Canada trade deadline, was deliberate. As Carney strengthened Brussels' ties, Trump intensified his tariff campaign. No exemption mentions, no movement on steel or energy, just increased pressure. For Ottawa, this wasn't about rhetorical retaliation. It was about reshaping geopolitical relationships. While Washington may have underestimated Carney's quiet determination, the coming weeks would test that strategy daily. Because in 30 days, time would expire. If you found this video valuable, give it a like and subscribe for more. Also, for more coverage of US-Canada trade news, subscribe to our channel and click the bell to be the first to hear the news.